Welcome back to Energy and the Human Organism. My intention with today's video is to illuminate the relationship of the psyche with the soma, the relationship of our mental cognitive self with our physical tangible self, the psyche and the soma. So let's begin by understanding what we're talking about when we say psyche. Because we can make this simple. We can also make it as complicated as we want to. The universe is built on infinite fractal differentiation. We see that in the periodic table. We see it in our biology. We see it in our genetics and in the species on our planet. The nature of the universe is infinite fractal differentiation, which means that anything we talk about in these videos can be a whole other conversation all by itself, which will spawn other questions and conversations. And that's what makes this a lot of fun. And now that's how the psyche works. So let's talk about what goes into the psyche and how it expresses itself through our body. We have two things to start with, which is the idea of our conscious and the idea of our unconscious psyche. Two sides of the same coin, dark side of the moon, bright side of the moon, the conscious and the unconscious. So the consciousness is our intellectual self, our mental self, our ego, our persona that we outwardly present to the environment around us. This is who we think we are. This is the voice in our head. This is our consciousness. On the other side of that, we have our unconscious. Our unconscious contains our programming, our complexes, the things that run in the background without our immediate awareness of them. This can be things like wishes and fantasies that we have. This can be our childhood experiences, our cultural programming, anything that we are unable or unwilling to bring into our conscious life for whatever reason exists within the unconscious. And so it's important to appreciate the feedback loop that exists between the consciousness and the unconsciousness, because remembering that our consciousness is what we show to everyone. This is the voice in our head and who we think we are and the things that we think we know about our environment. So if we are holding things in the unconscious, and we all are all the time, but that's going to then influence, not control, but influence what shows up through our conscious personality, through our persona, and in the voice in our head that tells us who we think we are and what we think we know. I think it's valuable to note also that means our psyche exists, at least in part, in imagination. Because we're talking about fantasies and memories and opinions and preferences that we have, that we carry, and that have an energetic underpinning because everything does. And so there's a relationship there. There's a relationship between what exists in our imagination and what shows itself in our persona and in the way we talk to ourselves. Our persona is going to interact with our external environment, so it is also relevant to the conversation. But for the sake of our purposes, let's start with focusing a little bit more on that voice in our head, who we think we are and what we think we know, which is being influenced all the time by unconscious things that we're holding in our imagination. So what does that have to do with the physical, tangible self? What does that have to do with our SOMA? And let's bring it back now. We know that the SOMA has an autonomic component of the nervous system that is always running in the background. This is our physiological programming. We just mentioned our psychic, meaning from the psyche, our psychic programming that exists within our subconscious, or unconscious, that exists within our imagination and our memories and our experiences and everything that has gone into this organism. So we know that we have that physiological programming that's running in the background all of the time, and that it is also unconscious. Now, our bodies produce sensations, which we experience via the somatic division of the nervous system, which is our ability to take a snapshot of our environment in the present moment. And you may remember from the last video that what the somatic nervous system, what our physical, tangible surveillance system is wanting to tell us and helping us decide at any given moment is whether or not we're safe. That's our primal biological survival mechanism. Are we safe or do we need to run? And so that's happening all the time. Our conscious self, our persona that we present to the environment, exists within the present moment. Our somatic nervous system, our ability to perceive and physically respond in terms of muscles and movement, that exists within the present moment. Our unconscious psyche exists in the imagination. The imagination exists wherever it wants to. It is not limited to the present moment. It can remember. It can travel ahead. It can make predictions. And so there's a relationship between our unconscious psychic self and the physical body, in that it's influencing the area of our brain which takes in information from the body and takes in information from the environment and makes a prediction about the significance of all of that information. Are we safe or are we not? And what do we need to do about that? That is how we as a species evolved to be really successful in our environment, is because we learned to make predictions based on what we know. And we understand, when we understand the relationship between the soma and the psyche and the way that these divisions work and speak to each other, so we understand that the prediction center that we have running in our brain, which I like to refer to as the storyteller. And so as we go forward, you'll hear about the storyteller more. But the storyteller makes predictions about the significance of its observations based on what we have running in the background of our imagination. In part, but it's there. It's in the equation. It's here, it's on the map. So we have this sort of predictive, narrative-based feedback mechanism that's happening all the time and is expressed via the autonomic nervous system, via those background functions that are built into our physiology that keep us alive and fluctuate based on the state of our environment and whether or not we feel safe. Among other things, but that's a really important piece of it. So if our conscious mind is who we think we are and what we think we know about the environment, our conscious mind in the soma manifests itself in that voice in our head, in this narrative predictive process, in stories, in the stories that we tell ourselves, about our environment, about who we think we are and what we think is going on with all of this. And our body responds accordingly. Our physical, tangible, somatic body responds accordingly via the physiological processes of the autonomic nervous system. Which brings us back to homeostasis. Homeostasis, as we remember biologically, is our baseline, is where we feel comfortable. You might even say where we feel safe, where we feel this is familiar to us. We know this. And so we understand that there is a physiological homeostasis baseline that exists in our physiological processes because everything is a feedback loop around that homeostasis line. And all of those physiological processes are running in the background all of the time. And we also have a psychological homeostasis point where we feel safe and comfortable, and we know this, and we relate with that idea of who we think we are and what we think we know, and the significance of all of the sensations and observations that we're making. We have a homeostasis point in our psyche that we also like to stay close to. And so if the idea that we're here to talk about is this idea of learning how to operate the organism consciously, then we need to understand where are we setting our homeostasis point? Because if our homeostasis point has been determined thus far by our experiences and our memories and our programming that may or may not be conscious, may or may not be imaginary, and that is what has been determining our homeostasis point, that's okay. But we can do that differently. And we can insert our consciousness into the trajectory of the organism along its homeostasis point. We mentioned this idea of how the autonomic system can be in tug of war with itself, trying to go two directions at the same time. Or we can find an easy balance that doesn't take a lot of energy to maintain, that's not very hard on the vehicle, that feels pretty comfortable as we move through. And I think that we can draw sort of a similar analogy to the relationship between our physiological homeostasis point and our psychological homeostasis point. And if we go through our life with our psyche and our soma at war with each other, it's hard on the organism. When we examine what are we putting into the system, somatically and psychologically, what do we have running in the background, because we can make that investigation and we can do that work and we can clarify what's coming in order to better maintain a more comfortable homeostasis point, which is how we will be successful in our environment. Which is what we're here to talk about. Thank you for listening. I hope this was useful.